Hey guys, welcome to Chapter 9, where we really get started on cellular respiration. So cellular respiration often gets a bad rap for being really complicated and terrible, but it's actually got a lot of very cool biochemistry going on. So we're not going to fall into that trap of cellular desperation. Instead, we're going to take cellular inspiration from this process. So cellular respiration generally broken up into a few parts. So we've got glycolysis, which will happen in the cytosol of our eukaryotic cells. We'll also have a step that isn't quite shown here, but we'll talk about it, where we're going to take our pyruvate and process it and get it ready to enter the citric acid cycle. This will happen in the matrix of the mitochondria. Once it's ready to go, we'll insert it into the citric acid cycle, let it take its turn around, and in the meantime, while all of this is going on, we'll be collecting electrons. So these electrons will ultimately make their way to the electron transport chain, where we'll be able to use kind of a little biological current to create ATP via oxidative phosphorylation. So there are a few steps here. Each one has its own kind of complex intricacies, but we'll mostly be focusing on what happens to the carbon and what happens to the electrons. So we'll see in the next few slides that the main point of all of these processes is to pull electrons from carbon, put them through the electron transport chain to get ATP. So we really only care about where the electrons are headed. So let's get started with the reactions of cellular respiration. So before we get into our well-known net reaction for cellular respiration, let's consider another type of reaction that we know gives off energy. So here we've got, again, kind of a carbon-hydrogen compound. We're going to react that with molecular oxygen, and we end up getting water, carbon dioxide, and energy. So this may look familiar to you. Hopefully you've seen one of these before. This is a combustion reaction. We can compare that just briefly to our reaction for cellular respiration. We've got glucose, which we know has some carbons, 6 to be exact, and some hydrogens. React that with oxygen. We get water, carbon dioxide, and energy. So we'll get back to this in a moment, but for now, just note some of the similarities. So let's go back to that combustion reaction. It's a little bit easier and more straightforward to think about some of the principles by comparing it to this reaction. So a combustion reaction, generally speaking, is a type of reaction called a redox reaction. So hopefully you remember a little bit about these from general chemistry, but we're going to review it some just in case. So a redox reaction, what we should be thinking about is something losing electrons or being oxidized and something gaining those electrons or being reduced. So redox reactions involve the transfer of electrons from one place to another. Okay, so in this case, again, our reactant loses electrons. It's going to be oxidized. That will be carbon, ultimately from this combustion reaction. The one that gains electrons, which we'll see will be oxygen, is going to be reduced. So you can remember that. Leo the lion says grr. Loss of electrons is oxidation. Gain of electrons is reduction. Okay, so throughout this, the whole theme of cellular respiration, we'll be talking about oxidation of carbon or pulling electrons from carbon. So going back to that combustion reaction, thinking about electrons, and this is just a loose depiction, so this is not exactly the way electrons move, but you can think about the electrons again being lost from carbon and gained by oxygen. Our carbon is oxidized, and then our oxygen will end up getting these electrons, so the oxygen is reduced. We're going to see some similar themes. Okay, so let's again just briefly review principles about redox reactions so we feel really comfortable identifying them before we get back to our primary reaction, our net reaction for cellular respiration. So the movement of electrons in some redox reactions is really easy to identify. So here's a reaction that has nothing directly to do with cellular respiration, but it's just easy to track the electrons. So you can see that we've got our copper and magnesium. Pretty easy to see that copper is going to gain some electrons, magnesium is going to lose some electrons. So this is really easy. But sometimes it's not so easy to tell what happens. This can be the case when we look at the reactions of cellular respiration. So to make this concept a little bit easier so we can start to identify where we're losing electrons, we can consider a simple hydrocarbon. So this is methane, okay? So these are its electrons, and you can notice that all 4 of carbon's bonds right now are with hydrogen. And so these electrons are being shared more or less equally. There's kind of joint custody of these electrons going on between carbon and its hydrogen. So carbon is sharing more or less happily. So all of this starts to change once oxygen gets involved, and we'll see how that's going to progress in the context of cellular respiration. For now, let's check out oxygen. So oxygen is something very electronegative. Okay, so this is all the elements. It shows their electronegativity. You can see that oxygen is almost at the top of being one of the most electronegative things. Okay, so there'll actually be a couple other things that are more electronegative than oxygen. I won't spoil it, but we'll find out about those in chapter 10. So our oxygen, very, very electronegative. And what that means is that it wants all the electrons, and it doesn't care who you are, it will push you down and take them. So oxygen is really trying to get those electrons. So let's add oxygen into this equation. So we've got now some methanol, and this is going to be a hydroxyl group. Previously, again, when these were all hydrogen bonds, or like bonds with hydrogen, we were sharing these electrons equally. Now that oxygen's in the picture, the oxygen wants these electrons for itself, and it will pull them away from carbon. So now our carbon is oxidized and oxygen is reduced. So the reason I said this may be a little bit difficult to see is if you're just looking at the structure of methanol, you may not think about exactly where the electrons are because this bond still exists. But the trend that we're going to look for is the more bonds with oxygen, the less electrons carbon can actually have. So we can keep going with this and keep adding oxygen into this equation. So now we've got double bond. So again, our bonds with hydrogen, we're sharing these, okay? But now, since our other bond is up here in a double bond with oxygen, we now are going to have even less electrons for carbon, even more for oxygen. Okay, we can keep going, convert this into a carboxyl group. All right, so oxygen has even more electrons. So you can see we've now pulled these electrons to this oxygen. This one has all of the ones from before, and we only have the shared bond with hydrogen to allow carbon to continue having any custody of electrons at all. So now let's look at a case where all 4 of carbon's bonds are tied up in bonds with oxygen. So this is the most oxidized state that we're going to see. Okay, so this is seriously oxidized. You can see there's nothing left to lose for carbon. It doesn't have any custody of any electrons at all. All of its bonds are tied up with oxygen. And remembering what molecule this is, it's carbon dioxide in case you just didn't want to guess. Okay, so carbon dioxide we know is going to be one of the products of cellular respiration. It was also a product of that combustion reaction. This is the exact carbon dioxide that you exhale. This is exactly why it's going to be a waste product, because we've already taken everything from it that we possibly can. So it's all used up. We don't need it anymore. This is exactly why we exhale it. So we will get to the precise moments when these carbon dioxide molecules leave. But for now, let's just consider the trend. The closer we get to being carbon dioxide, the more we have oxidized this carbon, the more that we've used it up, and the more that we've gotten anything from it that we can. So let's get back to the reactions of cellular respiration. Okay, so again, comparing it to our combustion reaction, both have kind of carbony compounds that have carbons and bonds with hydrogens. We have oxygen as reactant. We'll get water and carbon dioxide as products, and then energy. Our combustion reaction generally releases that energy in the form of heat. For cellular respiration, we're trying to get ATP, or chemical energy, from this. So if these have so many things in common, why doesn't eating end up like a Michael Bay movie? Okay, so the answer to that, no, you don't have to worry about spontaneous combustion, because the reason that we can safely eat and convert all of this energy into actually making ATP and not hot fiery explosions is because we have a different path that the electrons take going from carbon to oxygen. So in combustion reaction, the electrons snap. They go really quickly, and the energy is released as heat. So think of a rubber band snapping back. If you even imagine, this is going to be our carbon, our electrons snapping quickly to oxygen, releasing this as heat. It's very, very direct. Whereas cellular respiration, we have many steps. We've got all of glycolysis, pyruvate processing, oxidation. We're going to have citric acid cycle. So in cellular respiration, eventually, we haven't even gotten the electrons to oxygen yet. That will happen at the end of the electron transport chain, but we're taking our sweet time getting there. So this large change in free energy is going to be slowed. It's not going to be a direct snap. It's going to be slowed by all of these steps, glycolysis, and the progressive oxidation of carbon. So these act sort of like a buffer. The electrons will take, traveling electrons going downhill, this free energy, until we safely get it to oxygen. Okay, so that's going to be the main difference. So when you're struggling to learn these reactions, if you feel like they're a little bit overwhelming, just remember that they're all that stand between us and hot, fiery combustion. Okay, so we'll get back to some of these elements of free energy a little bit later, but for now, it's just enough to understand that we're going to be kind of slowing the descent of electrons to oxygen so that we can actually harness this. This energy can be converted to ATP. Okay, so while the net reaction for cellular respiration is going to basically be a redox reaction, the oxidation of carbon, this process is broken up into many smaller reactions. And generally speaking, I like to categorize things so you can kind of divide the overall gist of these reactions into smaller redox reactions. We'll be able to learn to identify those in a minute. Transfers of phosphates. Those will be particularly important when you see ATP enter and leave these scenarios. And just general rearrangements trying to get from point A to point B. So these aren't necessarily all technical terms for these reactions, but the main purpose of what they're going to be doing. So let's spend a little time talking about these redox reactions in the context of cellular respiration. So a common misconception when we start to talk about glycolysis is that ATP is the most important product you'll get from this part of the process. So while it's true that ATP is certainly the end goal when we get to the end of electron transport, the main prize in glycolysis, and actually throughout all the way through the citric acid cycle, is going to be found in our redox potential, which will mostly be in the form of NADH. So if you look through these reactions and you think of NADH as sort of a side product, that would be a mistake. NADH is one of the most important things that we can get. And in the context of glycolysis, pyruvate, which will give us more potential energy to continue to oxidize carbons so that we get even more of these electrons. So we'll learn a little bit about NADH in a minute, but this is going to be one of our most important parts. It's going to actually carry the electrons that we need. So we'll see how that works in a minute. For right now, what we need to know is that NADH is one of the most important parts, and the ATP that we get in glycolysis specifically, or the citric acid cycle, is more like those bonus fries that you find in the bottom of the bag. So they're not the main set of fries, the ones that have the most, but they're kind of like, oh, sweet, I got some bonus fries, kind of a feeling. That's how you should feel about the ATP generated in glycolysis. NADH is the main container of fries, so that's what we're going to be trying to live off of. Okay, so let's explore the idea of NADH a little bit further. Okay, so NAD plus NADH, these are going to be what actually carry the electrons. So again, the most important part of cellular respiration is to harvest electrons from carbon and take those electrons to the electron transport chain, period. So because we have to take electrons from carbon, we need some way to transport them. This way is largely using NAD plus NADH. So NAD plus can be thought of as kind of an empty electron taxi. So it's ready to pick up cargo. Okay. The way I like to think about electrons, as we're going to be picking them up in cellular respiration, is to think about the idea of a hydrogen. Okay, so a hydrogen has one proton, one electron. What we're actually going to be taking is a hydrogen, a full-on hydrogen, and one free electron. So a full hydrogen and one electron. So I think of it, it's not exactly this, but kind of like 1.5 hydrogens, okay? So that will help explain the NADH part of this. This is really what's going on. And this NADH has 2 electrons. The proton goes elsewhere. I don't care about it now. It's not important for this part yet. So back to our taxi, our NAD plus is empty. It can carry 2 electrons. The electrons get in. This is NADH. Remember, hidden underneath that H is 2 electrons. Okay, so this is a full hydrogen and 1 electron. When we get to the destination, so this will be the electron transport chain, we dump the electrons out. The proton that was attached here can go elsewhere. It's not going to be part of it. And the empty NAD plus can go back to start this again. So really, the key concept is that NAD plus picks up 2 electrons. You will see this, easy to identify with the H, if you think about the hydrogen as containing one of these electrons. So when you see the H, you're going to say, okay, we picked up a full H, a full hydrogen. We've got electrons loaded. Those electrons, again, will get dumped out later at the electron transport chain. For now, we're just trying to collect them from carbon. So thinking of this as the electron taxi, again, the most important part of cellular respiration is collecting electrons. Therefore, this NADH is one of the most important things that we should keep track of. It's not just a side thought after ATP at this point. We're going to use it to get ATP later, but understanding the whole rest of cellular respiration, we need to take into account how important this is at present. So we've talked about a few different types of reactions. I've mentioned that redox reactions happen. In the context of cellular respiration, you'll see these happen whenever NADH is formed. We'll also have phosphate transfer that will happen in the generation or use of ATP. We'll see that more in a bit, and general rearrangements. So for this video, we won't talk about the exact structures of glycolysis, more just kind of recap some of those ideas, those principles of redox, and kind of get prepared for what's going to come. So again, keeping in mind that as we go through glycolysis, now looking at this structure again, glycolysis happening in the cytosol, we're collecting electrons. Now the top part of this should seem a lot more important. Okay, this ATP down here, this is a bonus fry. ATP, it's the NADH that we really care about. It's going to help us create a lot more ATP. We're then going to see our pyruvate created, enter the citric acid cycle, and we're going to collect more electrons as we go. The citric acid cycle is going to be a huge payoff for us. So in the next couple of videos, we'll start to explore the reactions of glycolysis specifically, then that pyruvate processing step and the citric acid cycle, and then finally, next week, we'll start to look at electron transport. So I'll see you guys in the next video.